The hallways of Lincoln Elementary smelled like disinfectant and childhood dreams, a combination that Mike Johnson had learned to associate with purpose more than any motivational poster ever had. He pushed his cart through the maze of lockers, each one decorated with stickers and crayon drawings that told the story of 300 kids trying to figure out their place in the world. The squeak of his cart's wheels echoed off the tile floors, creating a rhythm that had become the soundtrack to his days over the past 12 years. Mike paused outside classroom 3B, where he could hear Mrs. Peterson's voice explaining fractions to a group of third graders who were clearly more interested in the recess bell than mathematical concepts. Through the window in the door, he could see the usual collection of fidgeting 8-year-olds, some paying attention, others drawing in notebooks, and one small figure in the back corner who seemed to be vibrating with barely contained energy. That would be Brix. Mike had first met Brix 3 weeks ago, on the alien child's first day at Lincoln Elementary. The kid in Mike thought of him as a kid, despite the fact that he wasn't technically human, had been bouncing off the walls, so literally that he'd left small dents in the drywall. Principal Martinez had called it an integration challenge. The other kids had called it weird. Mike had called it Tuesday. Lincoln Elementary was one of the first schools in the district to participate in the Interspecies Education Initiative, a program designed to help non-human children adapt to human educational environments. On paper, it was a beautiful example of inclusive education and galactic cooperation. In practice, it mostly meant that Mike spent a lot more time patching walls and cleaning up substances that weren't covered in any janitorial manual. The bell rang and classroom doors burst open like floodgates, releasing streams of children into the hallways. Mike stepped aside, letting the chaos flow around him with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned that fighting the tide only got you wet. Most of the kids barely noticed him. He was part of the scenery, as familiar and unremarkable as the water fountains or fire extinguishers. But Brix noticed that the alien child rocketed out of classroom 3B like he'd been shot from a cannon, his movements so quick and erratic that he seemed to be in 3 places at once. He had skin that looked like it was made of polished copper, with patterns that shifted and swirled when he moved quickly. His eyes were larger than human eyes, a bright golden color that seemed to glow with their own inner light. And his energy levels were somewhere between a sugar-high kindergartner and a small nuclear reactor. "Mr. Mike," Brix called out, careening toward the janitor with the kind of enthusiasm that usually preceded accidents. "Mr. Mike, look what I made." Mike braced himself as Brix skidded to a stop just inches away, vibrating with excitement. The kid held up a piece of paper covered in what appeared to be mathematical equations written in symbols that definitely weren't from any human textbook. "That's very interesting, Brix," Mike said, examining the alien mathematics with the same careful attention he gave to every child's artwork. "What does it do?" "It calculates the optimal trajectory for dodgeball throws based on gravitational variables and wind resistance," Brix explained, bouncing on his toes. "Mrs. Peterson said we were learning about fractions, so I thought I'd show her how fractions can be used to calculate projectile physics." Mike looked at the equations again. He didn't understand the symbols, but there was something undeniably sophisticated about the way they were arranged. This wasn't random scribbling. This was actual mathematics, probably more advanced than anything taught in elementary school. "Did Mrs. Peterson like it?" Mike asked, though something in Brix's expression suggested he already knew the answer. Brix's golden eyes dimmed slightly. "She said it was showing off, and that I should focus on the lesson like everyone else." Then Tommy Morrison said I was trying to be a know-it-all. And Sarah Chun said my math looked like chicken scratches. Mike felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He'd seen this pattern before: bright kids who didn't fit the standard mold getting discouraged, learning to hide their abilities to avoid standing out. It was heartbreaking enough when it happened to human children. Watching it happen to a kid from another species felt like a whole new level of wrong. "You know what I think?" Mike said, carefully folding the paper and handing it back to Brix. "I think Mrs. Peterson probably didn't understand your math because it's more advanced than what she's used to teaching. And Tommy and Sarah probably said those things because they felt left out." "Really?" "Really. When people don't understand something, They sometimes react by trying to make the person who does understand feel bad about it. It's not right, but it happens. Bricks considered this, his copper-colored skin shifting through different patterns as he thought. On my homeworld, if someone shows advanced knowledge, the others gather around to learn from them. Sharing knowledge is considered an honor. That sounds like a good system, Mike said. Maybe we can figure out a way to make that work here too. The second bell rang, indicating the end of passing period. Kids scattered toward their next classes, leaving the hallway empty except for Mike, Bricks, and the usual collection of dropped pencils and forgotten homework assignments. Bricks, Mike said, as the alien child started to head toward his next class. If anyone gives you trouble about being smart or different, you come find me, okay? I'm usually around somewhere. Bricks's eyes brightened again. You don't think I'm weird? I think you're interesting, Mike replied. And interesting is a lot better than boring. As Bricks bounced away toward art class, Mike started picking up the debris left behind by the passing crowd. A crumpled test paper here, a broken crayon there, the usual archaeology of childhood education. But as he worked, he found himself thinking about Bricks's advanced mathematics and the casual cruelty of 8-year-olds who didn't understand that different didn't mean wrong. Mike had been working at Lincoln Elementary for 12 years, ever since his daughter Emma had started kindergarten. Here, he'd originally taken the job because the hours worked well with single parenting. He could drop Emma off at school, work while she was in class, and be done by the time she needed to be picked up. It was supposed to be temporary, just until he could find something better. But somewhere along the way, temporary had become permanent. Emma had graduated and moved on to middle school, then high school, then college. She was 20 now, studying environmental science at the State University and planning to save the world one ecosystem at a time. And Mike was still here, still pushing his cart through the same hallways, still cleaning up after other people's children. He'd never regretted it, though. There was something deeply satisfying about being part of the infrastructure that kept childhood functioning. When a kid spilled paint all over the art room, Mike was there to clean it up. When someone got sick in the hallway, Mike made it disappear. When the heating system broke down in winter, Mike jury-rigged solutions that kept everyone warm until the repair crew arrived. He was invisible to most of the adults, but kids noticed him. They said hi in the hallways, asked him about his weekend, showed him their projects and artwork. Some of them, like Bricks, seemed to think he was the most important person in the building. And maybe, in some ways, he was. Mike finished collecting the hallway debris and headed toward the main office, where Principal Martinez would probably have a list of minor disasters that needed attention. The intercom system was crackling again. The boys' bathroom on the second floor had a leaky faucet, and someone had apparently tried to flush a toy car down the toilet in the kindergarten. Wing dot, just another day at Lincoln Elementary. But as he walked, Mike found himself thinking about Bricks's advanced mathematics and wondering what other talents the alien child might be hiding. More importantly, he wondered what would happen to those talents if Bricks learned to suppress them to fit in with his human classmates. That afternoon, Mike was replacing burned-out light bulbs in the library when he heard the commotion. Raised voices, the sound of books hitting the floor, and underneath it all, a high-pitched whining noise that made his teeth ache. He dropped what he was doing and followed the sound to the reading corner, where he found a scene that made his blood pressure spike. 3 fourth graders Tommy Morrison, Jason Weber, and Alex Kowalski had cornered Bricks behind a bookshelf. The alien child was curled up in a ball, making that awful whining sound, while the older boys stood over him with expressions that mixed cruelty with the kind of scientific curiosity that usually ended badly. Make that noise again, freak, Tommy was saying. I want to record it on my phone. Leave me alone, Bricks whispered, but the whining sound continued, seeming to come from somewhere deep in his chest. What's it doing? Jason asked, poking Bricks with the toe of his sneaker. Is it broken or something? Mike stepped into view, and the mood changed instantly. The 3 fourth graders suddenly found the floor very interesting, while Bricks looked up with eyes that were bright with tears. Boys, Mike said quietly, I think you have somewhere else to be. We weren't doing anything, Tommy protested. You were just leaving, Mike interrupted. his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from 12 years of dealing with children who thought they were cleverer than adults. Now, the three boys scattered, shooting resentful looks back at Mike and Bricks, but not quite brave enough to argue further. Mike waited until they were completely gone before kneeling down next to the alien child. "You okay, buddy?" Bricks uncurled slightly, the whining sound fading to a barely audible "I'm sorry I made noise in the library. I know the rules say to be quiet." "Don't worry about the noise," Mike said gently. "Worry about whether you're hurt. Did they hurt you?" "Not physically," Bricks said, which was an oddly mature way for an 8-year-old to put it. "But they said ... they said things." "What kind of things?" Bricks was quiet for a moment, his copper skin shifting through patterns that Mike was beginning to recognize as emotional responses. "They said I don't belong here, that I should go back to my own planet and stop trying to be human." Mike felt that familiar tightness in his chest, but this time it came with a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. He'd dealt with bullying before, was an unfortunate constant in any school. But there was something particularly cruel about targeting a child for being from a different species. "Bricks," Mike said carefully, "do you want to be human?" "I want to fit in," Bricks replied. "I want to have friends and play games and learn things without everyone staring at me like I'm some kind of science experiment." "That's not the same as wanting to be human," Mike pointed out. "You can fit in and have friends and learn things while still being exactly who you are. But I'm too different. I move too fast. I think differently. I get excited about things other kids think are boring." Bricks looked up at Mike with those golden eyes. "How can I fit in when everything about me is wrong?" Mike sat down cross-legged on the library carpet, putting himself at Bricks's eye level. "Can I tell you something? When my daughter Emma was in 3rd grade, she came home crying because the other kids said she was weird. Why did they think she was weird? Because she liked bugs. Not just liked them. She was obsessed with them. She could tell you the scientific name of every insect in the state, knew which ones were beneficial for gardens, understood their life cycles better than most adults. But 8-year-olds thought bug knowledge was gross and weird." Bricks seemed interested despite himself. "What happened?" "Well, Emma started pretending she wasn't interested in bugs. She stopped talking about them, stopped bringing books about entomology to school, tried to act like she cared about the same things as everyone else." Mike smiled at the memory. "It lasted about 2 weeks before she was miserable. She wasn't Emma anymore. She was just a pale copy of everyone else." "So, what did you do?" "I told her the same thing I'm telling you. The world needs people who think differently, who get excited about unusual things, who see solutions that everyone else misses. If everyone was exactly the same, we'd never solve any new problems or make any discoveries." Mike reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos until he found what he was looking for. "This is Emma today," he said, showing Bricks a picture of a young woman in field gear, holding some kind of monitoring equipment in what appeared to be a wetland environment. "She's studying how insect populations respond to environmental changes. Turns out that weird interest in bugs was actually the beginning of important scientific work. And you know what? She has friends now, other scientists, who think bug knowledge is fascinating." Bricks studied the photo with interest. "She found people who understood her? She found people who valued what made her different," Mike corrected. "And more importantly, she learned to value it herself." The next morning brought what Principal Martinez euphemistically called a situation. Mike arrived at school to find the parking lot buzzing with activity news vans, official-looking cars with government plates, and a small crowd of protesters, holding signs that said things like "Earth Schools for Earth Children" and "Stop the Alien Invasion." Mike parked his beat-up Honda between a Channel 7 news van and what appeared to be an unmarked federal vehicle, then grabbed his keys and headed for the employee entrance. The crowd was focused on the main entrance, where a reporter was setting up for what looked like a live broadcast. Inside, the school was in controlled chaos. Teachers whispered in clusters. Office staff moved with a kind of purposeful urgency that suggested crisis management, and Principal Martinez looked like she hadn't slept in a week. "Mike," she called when she spotted him. "Thank God. We need to talk." She led him into her office, where 2 people in suits were waiting. The woman had the look of a federal bureaucrat, expensive haircut, designer clothes, and the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. The man looked military, with a posture and bearing that screamed Special Forces, even in civilian clothes. Mike Johnson, Principal Martinez said, "This is Dr. Susan Hartwell from the Department of Interspecies Education, and Colonel James Morrison from, well, he'll explain that part." Dr. Hartwell extended a manicured hand. "Mr. Johnson, we understand. You've developed a rapport with the alien child. His name is Brix," Mike said, shaking her hand with the bare minimum of politeness. "And yes, we're friends, right, Brix?" Dr. Hartwell consulted a tablet. "We're here because there's been a complaint filed with the Federal Education Oversight Committee regarding his presence in this school." Mike looked at Colonel Morrison, noting the nameplate that identified him as Morrison, J. A chill ran down his spine. "Any relation to Tommy Morrison?" Colonel Morrison's jaw tightened. "My son, and he's described some very concerning behaviors from the alien child, such as aggressive episodes, unusual noises that cause physical discomfort to human children, and academic disruption through showing off advanced knowledge that makes other students feel inadequate." Mike stared at the colonel. "You're describing a kid having emotional responses to being bullied, making involuntary stress sounds when he's scared, and being smart. None of that sounds like grounds for removing him from school. The federal guidelines for interspecies education are very clear," Dr. Hartwell interjected. "Non-human students must demonstrate successful integration without causing disruption to the human learning environment. If they cannot adapt to human educational norms, alternative arrangements must be made." "Alternative arrangements?" "Species-specific educational facilities," Dr. Hartwell said smoothly. "Environments designed specifically for non-human learning, styles and social patterns." Mike felt his anger building. "You mean segregation?" "We prefer to think of it as specialized accommodation," Dr. Hartwell replied. "Some differences simply cannot be bridged through good intentions." Principal Martinez, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A comprehensive evaluation of the alien child's integration success," Colonel Morrison said. "If he cannot demonstrate appropriate behavior modification within a reasonable time frame, he'll be transferred to a more suitable facility." "And what constitutes appropriate behavior modification?" Mike asked. Dr. Hartwell consulted her tablet again. "Cessation of disruptive vocalizations, conformity to standard academic pacing, and successful social integration with human peers." "You want him to stop making sounds when he's stressed, dumb himself down to match 8-year-old humans, and somehow make friends with kids who've been calling him a freak for 3 weeks. We want him to demonstrate that he can function successfully in a human educational environment," Colonel Morrison said coldly. "Is that too much to ask?" Mike was about to respond when there was a commotion in the hallway outside. Through the office window, he could see Brix being escorted toward the office by Mrs. Peterson, who looked deeply uncomfortable. The alien child's copper skin was shifting through rapid pattern changes, and even through the closed door, Mike could hear the high-pitched whining sound that indicated severe distress. "Speak of the devil," Colonel Morrison muttered. Mike shot him a look that could have stripped paint, then moved toward the door. "I'll handle this." "Mr. Johnson," Dr. Hartwell called after him, "please remember that everything that happens from this point forward will be part of our evaluation." Mike paused with his hand on the door handle. "Lady, I've been watching out for scared kids for 12 years. I'm not about to stop now because you're taking notes." He opened the door and found Brix pressed against the hallway wall, surrounded by curious onlookers, and looking like he wanted to disappear entirely. Mrs. Peterson was trying to maintain some semblance of order, but the crowd of adults and the attention from his classmates was clearly overwhelming the alien child. "Hey, Brix," Mike said quietly, approaching slowly. "Rough morning?" Brix looked up at him with those golden eyes, wide with panic. "Mr. Mike, they want to take me away. Mrs. Peterson said there are people here who want to send me to a different school." "Nobody's taking you anywhere right now," Mike said firmly. "But we do need to talk to these people. Think you can handle that?" Brix nodded, though the whining sound continued at a barely audible level. Mike put a gentle hand on the child's shoulder. Noting how his alien anatomy felt both familiar and strange, the same basic structure as a human child, but with subtle differences in bone density and muscle tension. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," Mike said. "We're going to go into the office, and I'm going to sit right next to you. These people are going to ask you some questions, and you're going to answer them honestly. Don't try to be what you think they want you to be. Just be yourself. Can you do that? What if they don't like who I am?" Mike knelt down, so he was at Brix's eye level. "Then that's their problem, not yours. But I have a feeling that if you show them who you really are, they might be surprised." Back in the office, the formal evaluation began. Dr. Hartwell asked Brix a series of questions about his adjustment to human school, his academic experience, and his social interactions. Brix answered honestly, describing both his excitement about learning new things and his frustration with the pace and style of human education. "The math they teach here is very basic," Brix explained when asked about his academic experience. "On my world, children my age study quantum probability and dimensional physics. Here, they're still working on fractions." Colonel Morrison leaned forward. "Do you think that makes you better than the human children?" "No," Brix said, his copper skin shifting to darker patterns. "I think it makes me different. Like how some human children are better at art than I am, or how they understand social games that confuse me." "But you've been showing off your advanced knowledge in class," Dr. Hartwell said, consulting her notes. "That creates an unfair comparison for the human students." Brix was quiet for a moment, and Mike could see him struggling with how to explain something that seemed obvious to him. "When I was learning fractions, I got excited because I could see how they connected to the physics calculations I know. I wanted to share that because sharing knowledge feels good. I didn't know it would make other children feel bad. And the sounds you make when you're distressed," Colonel Morrison continued, "they're disruptive to the classroom environment." "I can't help those sounds," Brix said, his distress level clearly rising as the questioning continued. "They happen when I'm scared or overwhelmed. It's like when humans cry or shout. I don't choose to make them." The whining sound was getting louder, and Mike could see the alien child approaching his breaking point. Dr. Hartwell and Colonel Morrison exchanged glances, clearly noting the behavioral issue they'd come to document. "Brix," Mike said quietly, "remember what we talked about yesterday? About finding people who understand you?" Brix nodded, the whining sound softening slightly. "These people don't understand you yet," Mike continued, "but that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It just means they need more information." Mike turned to Dr. Hartwell and Colonel Morrison. "Can I ask you both something? How much do you actually know about Brix's species? About their developmental patterns, their social structures, their educational traditions?" Dr. Hartwell consulted her tablet. "The preliminary xenobiological reports indicate standard humanoid development with enhanced cognitive capacity and heightened emotional expression." "That's not what I asked," Mike said. "I asked how much you understand about who he is as a person and what his natural behaviors mean in the context of his own culture." Colonel Morrison frowned. "I don't see how that's relevant. He's in a human school, so he needs to follow human standards." "Is that how it worked when your son Tommy was struggling with math last year?" Mike asked quietly. The colonel stiffened. "How do you know about that?" "Because I pay attention to the kids in this school, and I remember when Tommy was failing third grade math because the teaching method didn't match his learning style. Mrs. Rodriguez worked with you to find alternative approaches that helped him succeed." Mike looked directly at Colonel Morrison. "Nobody suggested that Tommy should be removed from school because he needed different teaching methods. Nobody said he was disruptive for needing extra help. You found ways to accommodate his learning differences." "That's completely different," Dr. Hartwell protested. "Tommy is human." "So the accommodation is only available to human children?" Mike asked. "Non-human kids just have to adapt or leave." The room fell silent except for Brix's quiet whining, which was now barely audible, but still present. Principal Martinez, who had been taking notes throughout the conversation, finally spoke up. "Dr. Hartwell, Colonel Morrison, I have a question. What would constitute successful integration in your assessment?" Dr. Hartwell checked her tablet again. "Cessation of disruptive behaviors, academic performance within normal parameters for his age group, and positive social interactions with human peers. And if those criteria aren't met, transfer to specialized facilities designed for non-human education. Principal Martinez set down her pen. I see. And has anyone considered that maybe our criteria are wrong? Colonel Morrison looked annoyed. What do you mean? I mean that maybe the problem isn't that bricks can't adapt to our system. Maybe the problem is that our system isn't good enough to accommodate someone as remarkable as he is. The evaluation committee left that afternoon with a promise to return in 2 weeks for a follow-up assessment. Dr. Hartwell made it clear that Bricks would need to demonstrate significant behavioral modification if he wanted to remain at Lincoln Elementary. Colonel Morrison was less diplomatic, stating bluntly that his son and other human children shouldn't have to deal with alien disruptions. In their learning environment, Mike spent the rest of the day thinking about accommodation, adaptation, and what it really meant to belong somewhere. By the time the final bell rang, he'd made a decision that would probably get him in trouble with the administration, but felt like the right thing to do anyway. He found Bricks in the library, sitting alone in the reading corner with a book about space exploration that was clearly too advanced for his supposed grade level. The alien child was reading with the kind of intense focus that Mike recognized the look of someone escaping into knowledge because reality was too painful to deal with. Hey, buddy, Mike said, settling down on the carpet beside him. How was the rest of your day? Confusing, Bricks replied without looking up from his book. Mrs. Peterson kept giving me easier math problems, and during recess, Tommy Morrison told everyone I was going to be sent away to alien prison. Mike winced. Tommy Morrison has a big mouth and a small brain. Don't pay attention to him. But what if he's right? What if I can't learn to be human enough to stay here? Bricks, look at me. Mike waited until the alien child set down his book and made eye contact. You don't need to learn to be human. You need to learn to be yourself in a place where humans can understand and appreciate you. How do I do that? We're going to figure it out together. But first, I need to ask you something important. Do you trust me? Bricks nodded without hesitation. Good, because I have an idea, but it's going to require you to be brave and show people parts of yourself that you've been trying to hide. Over the next hour, Mike and Bricks developed what Mike privately called Operation Integration. Instead of trying to suppress Bricks's natural behaviors and abilities, they would find ways to channel them productively. Instead of hiding his differences, they would help others understand what those differences meant and how they could benefit everyone. Tell me about the sounds you make when you're stressed, Mike said. I know you can't control them, but do they serve a purpose on your world? Bricks considered this. They're communication signals. When a young person makes distress sounds, it alerts adults that help is needed. Different sounds mean different things: fear, confusion, physical pain, social isolation. So they're not just noise. They're actually a sophisticated communication system. Yes, but humans don't understand what they mean, so they just think, I'm being disruptive. Mike nodded. What if we taught people what the sounds mean? What if instead of asking you to stop making them, we helped others understand what you're trying to communicate? You think that would work? I think it's worth trying. What else? Tell me about your learning style. I know human education is too slow for you, but how do you naturally prefer to learn? On my world, we learn through exploration and connection making. When we study mathematics, we immediately look for applications in physics, engineering, art, music. Everything is connected to everything else. But here, each subject is taught separately. Yes, and it's very frustrating. When Mrs. Peterson teaches fractions, all I can think about is how they apply to orbital mechanics and musical harmonics and architectural ratios. But when I try to share those connections, she says I'm showing off or going off topic. Mike was beginning to see the scope of the problem. Bricks wasn't failing to integrate. He was being forced into an educational model that was fundamentally incompatible with how his mind worked. It was like trying to teach a fish to climb trees and then declaring fish incompetent when they failed. Okay, Mike said, here's what we're going to do. For the next 2 weeks, we're going to run an experiment. Instead of trying to make you fit into the existing system, we're going to show people what the system could look like if it was designed to include you. How? We're going to create situations where your differences become advantages, where your communication style helps solve problems, where your learning approach makes things better for everyone, not just you. The first opportunity came the next morning. Mike was fixing a broken desk in classroom 2A when he heard the commotion from next door. Mrs. Peterson's voice, raised in frustration, mixed with the sounds of third graders who were clearly off task and agitated. Mike poked his head into the classroom to find chaos. Half the students were out of their seats. Several were arguing about something math-related, and Mrs. Peterson looked like she was about 2 minutes away from a nervous breakdown. Problem? Mike asked. I'm trying to teach them about equivalent fractions, but they're not getting it, Mrs. Peterson explained, gesturing helplessly at the whiteboard covered with mathematical equations. They understand the concept when I explain it, but they can't seem to apply it to actual problems. Mike glanced around the room and spotted Bricks in his usual back corner, practically vibrating with suppressed energy. The alien child was staring at the whiteboard with the expression of someone who could see obvious solutions that everyone else was missing. Mind if I try something? Mike asked. Mrs. Peterson looked skeptical but desperate. At this point, I'll try anything. Mike walked over to Bricks's desk. Hey, buddy, I know you understand equivalent fractions. Think you could help explain them to the class? Bricks's eyes went wide, but Mrs. Peterson said, I shouldn't show off. This isn't showing off. This is helping. There's a big difference. Mike turned to address the class. Everyone, Bricks has a different way of thinking about fractions that might help you understand them better. Bricks, why don't you come up to the whiteboard? Bricks approached the front of the class nervously, his copper skin shifting through anxious patterns. But when he picked up the marker and started drawing, something magical happened. Instead of traditional fraction notation, Bricks drew visual representations that showed relationships between parts and wholes. He used circles and rectangles and triangles, showing how 1/2 and 2/4 and 3/6 were all different ways of describing the same amount. He drew pizzas cut into different numbers of slices, musical measures divided into different note values, and pie charts showing equivalent percentages. See, Bricks explained, his confidence growing as he drew. Fractions aren't just numbers, they're relationships. And the same relationship can be expressed in many different ways. Just like how you can say, I'm happy, or I'm pleased, or I'm delighted, and mean basically the same thing. The class was mesmerized. Even Tommy Morrison, who usually used any opportunity to make trouble, was paying attention. The visual approach Bricks was using made the abstract concept concrete in a way that traditional teaching methods hadn't achieved. That actually makes sense, said Sarah-chan, one of the students who had previously called Bricks's math chicken scratches. Can you show us how to do the homework problems? Asked another student. For the next 20 minutes, Bricks worked through the assigned problems using his visual method, with Mrs. Peterson and Mike watching in amazement as concepts that had been confusing suddenly became clear to the entire class. When the lesson was over, and the students were working quietly on practice problems, Mrs. Peterson pulled Mike aside. That was incredible, she whispered. I've been teaching for 15 years, and I've never seen third graders grasp equivalent fractions that quickly. Bricks sees connections that the rest of us miss, Mike replied. Instead of asking him to think like a human child, what if we learned from how he thinks? You mean use his approach with all the students? I mean recognize that different doesn't always mean worse. Sometimes it means better. The success in Mrs. Peterson's classroom was just the beginning. Over the next week, Mike arranged for Bricks to contribute his unique perspective to various situations around the school. When the art teacher was struggling to explain perspective drawing, Bricks's understanding of dimensional mathematics helped students visualize depth and proportion. When a group of second graders couldn't figure out how to share playground equipment fairly, Bricks's natural inclination toward logical problem solving helped them develop a rotation system that worked for everyone. Most importantly, Bricks's distress sounds became a tool for communication rather than a source of disruption. Mike worked with him to identify the different types of sounds and what they meant, then shared this information with teachers and students. When Bricks makes a low humming sound, it means he's thinking hard and needs a moment to process. Mike explained to a group of faculty during a lunch break. When the sound gets higher and more urgent, it means he's feeling overwhelmed and needs support. And when it stops completely, it usually means he's found a solution to whatever was bothering him. Mrs. Rodriguez, the special education coordinator, was particularly interested. This is actually very similar to how we work with human children, who have different communication needs. We teach people to recognize and respond to nonverbal cues. Exactly, Mike said. Bricks isn't broken or disruptive. He just communicates differently than we're used to. The change in the school's atmosphere was gradual but noticeable. Instead of seeing Bricks as a problem to be solved, teachers began viewing him as a resource to be utilized. Students stopped staring at him like he was a curiosity and started including him in games and group projects. The whining sounds that had once cleared hallways now prompted people to ask if he needed help. But the most significant change was in Bricks himself. The anxious, withdrawn child who had spent 3 weeks trying to make himself invisible was replaced by a confident, engaged student who bounced through the hallways with genuine excitement about learning and sharing knowledge. "Mr. Mike," Bricks said one afternoon as they worked together to repair a broken projector in the computer lab, "I think I'm starting to understand how friendship works here." "Yeah? What have you figured out?" "On my world, friendship is based on shared interests and complementary abilities. Friends help each other learn and grow by sharing what they know." Bricks carefully reconnected a loose cable while Mike held the projector steady. "I thought human friendship was different, but it's actually very similar. The difference is that here, I need to help people understand what I can share instead of assuming they already know." "That's pretty wise," Mike said. "How did you figure that out?" "When I helped with the fractions lesson, Tommy Morrison came up to me afterward and said my drawings were cool. He didn't apologize for calling me names, but he asked if I could help him with his homework." Bricks's skin shifted to brighter, more golden patterns. "I realized that he wasn't mean because he hated me. He was mean because he felt stupid compared to me. Once I showed him that I could help instead of just being better, we could be friends." Mike felt a warmth in his chest that he recognized as pride. Not just pride in Bricks's growing social skills, but pride in the school community that was learning to see differences as strengths rather than problems. "Speaking of Tommy," Mike said, "how are things with his dad? I know Colonel Morrison has been vocal about his concerns." Bricks's patterns shifted to more muted colors. "Tommy told me his father thinks I'm going to hurt someone or break something important. He doesn't understand that my species isn't dangerous. We're just energetic." "People fear what they don't understand," Mike said, "but understanding can be taught." The next day brought an opportunity to test that theory. Mike was replacing air filters in the gymnasium when the fire alarm went off. Not the scheduled drill that everyone had been expecting, but the real alarm that sent teachers and students streaming toward emergency exits with the kind of organized urgency that came from well-practiced procedures. Mike dropped what he was doing and headed for the nearest exit, doing a visual count of students as he moved. Most of the evacuation was proceeding smoothly, but as he reached the playground where everyone was supposed to gather, he noticed a problem. Bricks was missing. Mike did a quick scan of the assembled students and confirmed what he'd feared. All the third graders were accounted for except one. Mrs. Peterson was taking attendance, her voice tight with concern as she called out names. "Has anyone seen Bricks?" she called out. Several students shook their heads. Tommy Morrison raised his hand tentatively. "He was in the bathroom when the alarm went off," Tommy said. "I think he might still be inside." Mike's blood ran cold. The bathroom Tommy was referring to was on the second floor at the far end of the building from the main exits. If Bricks was still in there, he was either trapped or confused about the evacuation procedures. "I'm going back in," Mike told Principal Martinez, who was coordinating the evacuation from the playground. "Mike, you can't. The fire department is on their way, and we don't know what caused the alarm. That kid is scared and alone in there," Mike replied, already heading back toward the building. "I'm not leaving him." Mike had been in the school building during emergencies before, but never during a real fire alarm. The hallways were eerily quiet, filled with the sound of the alarm and the smell of something. Not smoke exactly, but something chemical and sharp that made his eyes water. He took the stairs 2 at a time, calling out as he went, "Bricks! Bricks! Where are you?" The sound that answered him was unlike anything he'd heard before. Not the usual stress whining, but something deeper and more urgent, a resonant, thrumming call that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Mike followed the sound to the second-floor boys' bathroom, where he found Bricks pressed against the far wall, his copper skin cycling through rapid color changes, and that thrumming sound pouring out of him like a siren. Bricks, thank God. Come on, we need to get out of here. But Bricks didn't move. Instead, he pointed toward the ceiling, where Mike could now see wisps of smoke emerging from one of the air vents. Fire, Bricks said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the word sound like a chorus. But not where everyone thinks. Mike looked around the bathroom, trying to understand what Bricks was seeing that he was missing. The smoke was definitely coming from the vent, but the alarm had been triggered in the main hallway, which would suggest a fire in a completely different part of the building. Bricks, how do you know where the fire is? I can smell it. Taste it. The chemicals in the air tell me exactly where it's coming from and what's burning. Bricks moved to the window, still making that thrumming sound. It's in the roof space above the computer lab. Electrical fire, probably started by the old wiring you've been complaining about. Mike stared at the alien child. You can analyze the composition of smoke by smell. My species evolved in an environment with frequent atmospheric changes. We had to be able to identify and locate chemical hazards quickly to survive. Bricks's thrumming intensified. The fire department is going to look in the wrong place if they follow the alarm sensors. The fire is spreading through the roof space toward the library. Mike grabbed his radio. Principal Martinez, this is Mike. I found Bricks, but we have a bigger problem. Mike, get out of there now. The fire department just arrived. Listen to me. The fire isn't where the alarm system says it is. It's in the roof space above the computer lab, spreading toward the library. Bricks can track it by smell. There was a pause. Mike, what are you talking about? Remember when I told you that Bricks has abilities we don't understand? This is one of them. He can identify the exact location and composition of the fire by analyzing the smoke. Another pause, longer this time. Are you sure? Mike looked at Bricks, who was now pressed against the window, his whole body resonating with that thrumming sound. I'm sure. Get the fire department to the computer lab and evacuate anyone from the library wing. Copy that. Mike and Bricks made their way out of the building, following evacuation routes, while Bricks continued to provide real-time updates on the fire's location and behavior. By the time they reached the playground, fire trucks were repositioning toward the computer lab, and additional personnel were being deployed to the library wing. 20 minutes later, Fire Chief Rodriguez approached Mike and Bricks with an expression of amazed gratitude. Son, he said to Bricks, I don't know how you did it, but your information was completely accurate. The fire was exactly where you said it was, burning exactly the materials you identified. If we'd followed the alarm system, we would have lost the entire library wing. Bricks's skin shifted to proud, bright patterns. My nose knows fire. Chief Rodriguez turned to Mike. How did he know all that? Enhanced sensory capabilities, Mike explained. His species evolved to analyze atmospheric composition for survival purposes. Well, he just saved half the school building and possibly several lives. Chief Rodriguez knelt down to Bricks's level. Thank you, son. That was real hero stuff. As the crowd began to disperse and the situation returned to normal, Mike noticed that the dynamic around Bricks had shifted again. Students who had previously avoided him were now approaching with curiosity and respect. Teachers were asking questions about his abilities. Even some of the parents who had been whispering about the alien kid were looking at him with new appreciation. But the most significant change was in Colonel Morrison, who approached Mike and Bricks with an expression that mixed embarrassment with something that might have been respect. Mr. Johnson, he said formally, I owe you and ... Bricks ... an apology. You don't owe me anything, Mike replied, but Bricks deserves to hear what you have to say. Colonel Morrison knelt down, putting himself at Bricks's eye level. Son, I was wrong about you. I thought you were a disruption, but today you proved that your differences make you valuable, not dangerous. I'm sorry for trying to have you removed from this school. Bricks studied the colonel's face with those golden eyes. Tommy told me you were scared that I would hurt someone. I understand being scared of things that are different, but I would never hurt anyone on purpose. I know that now, Colonel Morrison said, and I'm going to make sure everyone else knows it too. The fire incident changed everything. What had started as a quiet experiment in accommodation became a full-scale reevaluation of how Lincoln Elementary approached diversity and inclusion. Dr. Hartwell and her evaluation committee returned 3 days later to find a completely transformed environment. "This is highly irregular," Dr. Hartwell said, reviewing her notes in Principal Martinez's office. "Our preliminary assessment indicated significant integration challenges, but the reports we're receiving now suggest dramatic improvement. That's because we stopped trying to make bricks fit our existing system and started figuring out how to make our system work for him," Principal Martinez replied. "And the results speak for themselves." She pulled out a folder of documentation that Mike had helped compile over the past week. Test scores showing improved performance across multiple classes where bricks had contributed his teaching approach. Incident reports showing a dramatic decrease in bullying and social conflicts. And testimonials from teachers, students, and parents about the positive changes they'd observed. Mrs. Peterson reports that her students' understanding of mathematical concepts has improved by an average of 23% since implementing visual teaching methods inspired by Bricks's learning style. Principal Martinez continued, "The art teacher says that incorporating dimensional mathematics into perspective drawing has revolutionized how students approach spatial relationships." Dr. Hartwell looked skeptical. "And what about the behavioral issues? The disruptive vocalizations have become a valuable communication tool," Mike interjected from his seat next to Bricks. "Once we taught people what the sounds meant, they stopped being disruptive and started being informative." Furthermore, Principal Martinez added, "Bricks's enhanced sensory capabilities proved invaluable during our recent fire emergency. His ability to locate and analyze the fire saved significant property damage and potentially saved lives." Colonel Morrison, who had specifically requested to be included in this follow-up evaluation, spoke up. "Dr. Hartwell, I was the one who initiated the complaint against this child. I was wrong. Not just wrong about bricks specifically, but wrong about what successful integration looks like." Dr. Hartwell consulted her tablet. "Colonel, your original complaint cited academic disruption, behavioral issues, and social integration problems. Are you saying those concerns were unfounded?" "I'm saying those concerns were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what accommodation means," Colonel Morrison replied. "I thought successful integration meant making bricks act like a human child. What I learned is that successful integration means creating an environment where bricks can contribute his unique abilities while also learning alongside human children." "And your son, Tommy? How does he feel about these changes?" Colonel Morrison smiled. "Tommy's math grades have improved significantly since Bricks started helping him with homework. More importantly, he's learned that being different doesn't mean being wrong. That's a lesson I apparently needed to learn too." Dr. Hartwell made notes on her tablet, but her expression remained skeptical. "These improvements are impressive, but they represent accommodations for a single non-human student. How do we know this approach would scale to larger numbers of non-human children?" Mike stood up. "Dr. Hartwell, can I ask you something? How many human children in this school require some form of special accommodation? I don't see how that's relevant. Just humor me. How many kids here have IEPs, 504 plans, advanced placement accommodations, or other special services?" Dr. Hartwell consulted her tablet reluctantly. "According to the school records, approximately 23% of students receive some form of specialized educational accommodation. So nearly a quarter of our human students require modifications to the standard educational approach," Mike said. "But we don't consider that a failure of the system. We consider it good teaching practice. Why should accommodating non-human students be any different? Because the accommodations required for non-human students are significantly more complex, are they?" Principal Martinez interrupted. "Bricks's primary accommodations involved teaching people to understand his communication style and allowing him to contribute his knowledge in ways that benefited everyone. That's not more complex than what we do for students with autism, ADHD, or learning differences." Dr. Hartwell was quiet for a moment, clearly reassessing her evaluation criteria. "What you're describing isn't just accommodation, it's fundamental. Change to educational methodology." "Exactly," Mike said. "And that's why it works. Instead of asking Bricks to fit into an existing system that wasn't designed for him, we're evolving the system to be more inclusive and effective for everyone. Bricks, who had been listening quietly to this discussion, finally spoke up. Dr. Hartwell, may I ask you something? Of course. Why do you think my differences are problems to be solved instead of resources to be used? Dr. Hartwell blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct question from an 8-year-old. Because educational systems require consistency and standardization to function effectively. But I've seen the human children in my classes. They all learn differently too. Sarah learns best by reading, Tommy learns best by doing, and Maria learns best by listening. The teachers already use different methods for different students. That's different. How? Dr. Hartwell struggled for an answer. Because those are variations within normal human learning patterns. What makes human learning patterns more normal than mine? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Mike found himself holding his breath, waiting to see how Dr. Hartwell would respond to logic that seemed unassailable from an 8-year-old alien child. Dr. Hartwell started, then stopped. That's actually a very good question. On my world, Bricks continued, we have a saying, the garden grows strongest when it contains many different types of plants. Each plant needs different soil, different amounts of water, different amounts of sunlight, but together they create an ecosystem that's stronger than any single type of plant could be alone. You think schools should be like gardens? Dr. Hartwell asked. I think schools should help every student grow into what they're meant to become, not force every student to grow into the same shape. Mike looked at Dr. Hartwell and saw something he hadn't expected: uncertainty. The federal bureaucrat who had arrived with rigid evaluation criteria was being challenged by an alien child's simple wisdom. And she was actually considering it. Dr. Hartwell, Principal Martinez said quietly, what if we've been asking the saying, wrong question? Instead of asking whether non-human students can adapt to human educational systems, what if we ask how educational systems can evolve to serve all students more effectively? Dr. Hartwell set down her tablet. Continue. Every accommodation we've made for Bricks has also benefited human students. Visual mathematics helps students with different learning styles. Understanding nonverbal communication helps teachers work with students who have difficulty expressing themselves verbally. Creating inclusive environments where differences are valued reduces bullying and increases collaboration. What you're describing, Dr. Hartwell said slowly, would require fundamental changes to educational policy at the federal level. What we're describing, Mike corrected, is what good teachers have always done: figure out how to help every student succeed, whatever that requires. Colonel Lorison leaned forward. Dr. Hartwell, I came into this process convinced that accommodating non-human students would weaken our educational system. What I've learned is that the process of accommodation actually makes the system stronger for everyone. How so? Because it forces us to question our assumptions about what education is supposed to accomplish. Is the goal to produce students who all think and act the same way? Or is the goal to help every student develop their unique potential? Dr. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing everything she'd heard. Finally, she looked directly at Bricks. Bricks, are you happy here at Lincoln Elementary? Yes, Bricks replied without hesitation. This is the first place where I felt like being myself was okay. And do you feel like you're learning and growing? Every day, not just from the classes, but from figuring out how to be friends with human children and how to use my abilities to help instead of just being different. Dr. Hartwell made a note on her tablet and looked up at the assembled group. I need to consult with my supervisors, but I'm prepared to recommend that the Interspecies Education Initiative be expanded rather than restricted. Mike felt a surge of relief and pride. What does that mean? It means that instead of evaluating whether non-human students can adapt to human educational standards, we'll be evaluating how educational standards can evolve to serve all students more effectively. And Bricks gets to stay? Bricks gets to stay, Dr. Hartwell confirmed. More than that, he gets to be part of developing the model that will guide interspecies education policy across the country. The meeting ended with handshakes and tentative plans for future collaboration. As everyone prepared to leave, Dr. Hartwell approached Mike privately. Mr. Johnson, I have to ask, what made you so invested in defending this child? You could have simply followed protocols and avoided all this controversy? Mike thought about the question for a moment. Dr. Hartwell, I've been working in schools for 12 years. I've seen what happens when we give up on kids because they don't fit our expectations. And I've seen what happens when one person believes in a child enough to fight for them. And which outcome do you prefer? Mike looked across the room at Brix, who was excitedly telling Colonel Morrison about his latest mathematics project, while Tommy listened with genuine interest. I prefer the world where different kids get to become who they're meant to be, Mike said, even if it means we have to change how we do things. 3 months later, Lincoln Elementary had become something unprecedented in the American education system, a model for truly inclusive interspecies education. The changes that had started with accommodating one alien child had evolved into a comprehensive approach that benefited every student in the building. Mike found himself in the unusual position of being consulted by education experts from around the country who wanted to understand how a small-town elementary school had succeeded where major university research programs had failed. The answer, he told them, was surprisingly simple. They had stopped trying to fix the child and started fixing the system. The breakthrough wasn't in teaching Brix to be more human. Mike explained to a group of visiting educators who had come to observe the school's methods. The breakthrough was in recognizing that our educational approaches had become too narrow and rigid to serve all kinds of learners effectively. They were standing in what had once been a traditional classroom, but was now something more flexible and dynamic. Students worked in small groups, some at desks, others on floor cushions, still others standing at high tables. Brix moved between groups, helping with mathematical concepts, while human students contributed their own strengths to collaborative projects. What you're seeing, Principal Martinez explained to the visitors, is education that adapts to the students rather than forcing students to adapt to education. One of the visiting educators, Dr. Kim from a teacher's college in California, raised her hand. But how do you maintain academic standards when you're constantly accommodating different learning styles and abilities? Mike gestured toward a wall display showing student achievement data. Our test scores have improved across the board since we implemented these changes. When students learn in ways that work for them, they learn more effectively. More importantly, added Mrs. Peterson, who had become one of the strongest advocates for the new approach, students are developing critical thinking skills, collaboration abilities, and creative problem-solving capabilities that standardized curricula don't even measure. Dr. Kim consulted her notes, and this approach works for both human and non-human students. It works for all students, Mike corrected. We've stopped thinking in terms of human versus non-human and started thinking in terms of individual learning needs and strengths. To demonstrate, Mike called over a group of students who had been working on a science project together. The group included Brix, Tommy Morrison, Sarah Chun, and Maria Santos, 4 children whose different backgrounds and abilities had created something none of them could have achieved alone. Tell Dr. Kim about your water purification project, Mike suggested. Sarah, who had emerged as the group's natural spokesperson, stepped forward. We're designing a water filtration system for communities that don't have access to clean water. I did the research on existing filtration methods. Tommy built the physical prototype. Maria tested different filter materials. And Brix calculated the optimal flow rates and efficiency ratios. And how did you divide the work? Dr. Kim asked. Based on what each of us is good at, Tommy replied. I like building things with my hands. Sarah likes reading and research. Maria likes doing experiments. And Brix likes math and physics. But you all learned from each other too, Brix added. I taught them about fluid dynamics. Sarah taught us about research methods. Tommy taught us about construction techniques. And Maria taught us about experimental design. Dr. Kim made notes furiously. So instead of each student learning the same curriculum in the same way, they're developing complementary expertise while learning from each other's strengths. Exactly, Mike said. And the result is deeper learning and better outcomes for everyone involved. The visiting delegation spent the rest of the day observing classes, interviewing students and teachers, and documenting the methods that had transformed Lincoln Elementary. But the most significant moment came during lunch, when Dr. Kim approached Mike with a question that got to the heart of everything they had accomplished. Mr. Johnson, I have to ask, you're not a trained educator or child psychologist. How did you know that this approach would work? Mike considered the question while watching Bricks and his friends' animated discussion about their next project. I think it worked because I approached it like a maintenance problem. A maintenance problem? When something isn't working properly, you have two choices. You can throw it away and replace it with something else, or you can figure out what's wrong and fix it. Mike gestured around the bustling cafeteria. Everyone else was treating Bricks like a problem to be removed. I treated the situation like a system that needed repair. And what needed to be repaired? The assumption that there's only one right way to learn, communicate, and contribute to a community. Dr. Kim nodded slowly. So the solution wasn't to change Bricks. It was to change the environment he was trying to function in. The solution was to create an environment where everyone could function better, Mike corrected. Bricks just happened to be the catalyst that forced us to question our assumptions. That afternoon, Mike received news that would change his life in ways he hadn't expected. Principal Martinez called him into her office, where she was waiting, with Dr. Hartwell and a woman Mike didn't recognize, someone in an expensive suit who had the bearing of a high-level government official. Mike, Principal Martinez said, I'd like you to meet Secretary of Education Patricia Williams. Mike shook the woman's hand, trying not to show his surprise. Secretary Williams, this is unexpected. Mr. Johnson, I've been following the work you've done here at Lincoln Elementary. What you've accomplished in 3 months has implications that extend far beyond one small school. Secretary Williams gestured to a chair, and Mike sat down, wondering what exactly he was getting himself into. The president has asked me to develop a national framework for inclusive interspecies education, Secretary Williams continued. Based on what I've seen here, I believe you're the right person to lead that initiative. Mike blinked. I'm sorry, what? We want you to head up the Department of Inclusive Education, a new federal agency dedicated to developing and implementing educational approaches that serve all students, human and non-human, more effectively. Secretary Williams, I'm a janitor. I fix broken things and clean up messes. Mr. Johnson, you've just fixed one of the most complex problems in modern education and cleaned up a mess that had education experts stumped for years. Secretary Williams smiled. I can't think of better qualifications for the job. Mike looked around the room at Principal Martinez, Dr. Hartwell, and Secretary Williams, all of whom were looking at him expectantly. Can I ask what this job would actually involve? Working with schools across the country to implement the methods you've developed here, training educators to think differently about accommodation and inclusion, developing policy frameworks that prioritize student success over institutional convenience. And I'd be working with other schools that have non-human students. You'd be working with any school that wants to serve all their students more effectively, Dr. Hartwell clarified. The approaches you've developed here don't just work for interspecies education. They work for any situation where students need individualized learning support. Mike thought about Emma studying environmental science because a childhood fascination with bugs had been nurtured rather than discouraged. He thought about Bricks bouncing through the hallways with confidence because someone had seen his differences as strengths rather than problems. He thought about all the kids he'd watched over the years who might have thrived if someone had been willing to question the assumptions about how education was supposed to work. What about Bricks? Mike asked. And Lincoln Elementary? Lincoln Elementary will continue serving as a model and training site, Secretary Williams replied. And Bricks will continue being a student here, though I suspect he'll also become an important consultant for developing educational approaches for other non-human children. You want to make him a consultant? He's 8 years old. He's 8 years old, and he's already revolutionized how we think about learning differences. Dr. Hartwell pointed out, age is less important than wisdom, and that child has taught us more about effective education in 3 months than most experts learn in their entire careers. Mike was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what was being offered. A chance to take the lessons learned at Lincoln Elementary and apply them on a national scale. An opportunity to ensure that kids like Bricks and kids like Emma could find places where their differences were valued rather than hidden. If I took this job, Mike said finally, What happens to my position here? Principal Martinez smiled. Mike, we'd have to promote you to Director of Student Support Services anyway. What you've been doing unofficially needs to become an official part of how this school operates. So I'd still be here? Your office would be here. Your primary focus would be here. But your influence would extend to schools across the country, Secretary Williams clarified. Think of it as scaling up the maintenance approach. Instead of fixing problems in one building, you'd be helping fix systemic problems in education itself. Mike looked out the office window at the playground, where he could see Bricks and Tommy working together to explain some complex game to a group of younger children. The alien child's copper skin was bright with happiness, and his animated gestures suggested he was in full teaching mode. Okay, Mike said, but I have conditions. Secretary Williams raised an eyebrow, such as, first, any school that wants to implement these approaches has to commit to changing their systems, not just accommodating different students. This isn't about special programs for special kids. It's about better education for all kids. Agreed. Second, students like Bricks get to be involved in developing these programs, not as test subjects, but as partners. They understand their own needs better than any expert ever will. Also agreed. And third, Mike said, we focus on results, not policies. If something works for kids, we do it. If it doesn't work, we change it, no matter how many bureaucrats think it should work in theory. Secretary Williams laughed. Mr. Johnson, I think you're going to fit in very well in Washington. Or rather, Washington is going to have to figure out how to fit in with you. 1 year later, Mike stood in the Rose Garden at the White House, watching President Chun sign the Inclusive Education Act into law. The legislation, based on the principles developed at Lincoln Elementary, would transform how schools across the country approach diversity, accommodation, and student success. This law represents more than policy change, President Chun said in her remarks. It represents a fundamental shift in how we think about education, learning, and the value of individual differences. Standing next to Mike were Bricks and his parents, the first time Mike had met the alien child's family. Bricks's mother, Velana, was a diplomat with the same golden eyes and copper-toned skin as her son. His father, Corvin, was a scientist whose research on interspecies communication had informed much of the educational framework they developed. Mr. Mike, Bricks whispered during the ceremony, do you think other alien kids will have better experiences in school now? I think all kids will have better experiences in school now, Mike replied. That was always the point. After the ceremony, Mike found himself in the strange position of being congratulated by education experts, government officials, and interspecies diplomats who wanted to understand how a small-town janitor had revolutionized federal education policy. The key insight, Mike explained to a group of reporters afterward, was recognizing that accommodation isn't about making exceptions for different students. It's about creating learning environments that work better for everyone. And what's next for the Inclusive Education Initiative? Asked a reporter from the Education Times. Next, we take these principles and apply them everywhere, not just in schools with non-human students, but in any school where kids aren't thriving under traditional approaches. Can you give us some examples? Mike thought about the schools he'd visited over the past year, the teachers he'd trained, and the students whose lives had been transformed by simply changing how adults thought about learning differences. Rural schools where kids learn better through hands-on projects than textbook reading. Urban schools where students bring diverse cultural perspectives that enrich everyone's education. Schools serving kids with disabilities who have incredible strengths that traditional curricula don't recognize. So this isn't really about alien students at all? It's about recognizing that every student is unique and that our job as educators is to help each child develop their individual potential rather than forcing them all into the same mold. Later that evening, at a reception for education leaders, Mike found himself in conversation with Dr. Hartwell, who had become one of the strongest advocates for the inclusive education approach. I have to admit, Dr. Hartwell said, when I first met you, I thought you were naive about the complexities of education policy. And now I think the rest of us were naive about the complexities of actually helping children learn. Dr. Hartwell gestured around the reception, where educators from around the world were discussing implementation strategies and sharing success stories from their own schools. What you started at Lincoln Elementary has become a global movement, she continued. Schools in 12 countries are implementing inclusive education frameworks based on your work. It's not my work, Mike corrected. It's what happens when you listen to kids and focus on what actually helps them succeed. Speaking of which, Dr. Hartwell said, I have some news that might interest you. The Galactic Education Consortium has asked if Earth would be interested in hosting the first Interspecies Education Summit. The what now? Apparently, other species have been dealing with similar challenges in education and inclusion. They want to learn from what we've accomplished here and share their own approaches to serving diverse student populations. Mike looked across the room at Brix, who was animatedly explaining something to a group of education ministers. While using hand gestures that created shifting light patterns in the air around him, the alien child had grown more confident over the past year, but he'd never lost his enthusiasm for learning and sharing knowledge. I think Brix would love that, Mike said. He's always been interested in how different species approach education. Actually, he's already been invited to be one of the keynote speakers. Mike nearly choked on his drink. He's 9 years old. He's 9 years old, and he's the reason we're all here, Dr. Hartwell pointed out. Plus, he's developed some remarkable insights about cross-species communication and learning. 3 months later, Mike found himself at the International Space Station, which had been converted into a temporary conference facility for the first Interspecies Education Summit. Representatives from 47 different species had gathered to share approaches to inclusive education and discuss challenges in serving diverse student populations. Brix's presentation on learning as universal language was, according to the conference reviews, the most impactful session of the entire summit. The alien child, who had once been considered too disruptive for a human elementary school, was now being recognized as a leading voice in galactic education policy. The most important thing I learned, Brix told the assembled delegates, is that being different isn't a problem to be solved. It's a resource to be valued. Every species thinks differently, learns differently, and contributes differently. When we try to make everyone the same, we lose all the interesting possibilities. After the summit, as Mike and Brix traveled back to Earth aboard a crystalline transport ship, the alien child asked a question that had been bothering him. Mr. Mike, do you ever wish things had stayed simple? When I was just a problem student, and you were just a janitor. Mike thought about the question while watching Earth grow larger in the ship's viewport. Brix, do you remember what you told me about gardens? How they grow strongest when they contain many different types of plants? Yes. Well, I think people are like that too. We grow strongest when we're challenged to become more than we thought we could be. Mike smiled at his young friend. You challenged me to become more than just a janitor, and I challenged you to become more than just a problem student. And look what happened. We changed the world? We changed the world by refusing to accept that different meant wrong. As their ship approached Earth's atmosphere, Mike reflected on the journey that had brought them here. 1.5 years ago, he'd been a school janitor whose biggest challenge was fixing broken equipment and cleaning up spills. Now he was the director of inclusive education for the entire planet, working with species from across the galaxy to develop educational approaches that valued diversity rather than demanding conformity. But the most important thing hadn't changed. He was still the person who believed that every child, human or otherwise, deserved a chance to become who they were meant to be. And as long as there were kids like Brix who needed someone to believe in them, Mike would be there, ready to fix whatever systems needed fixing and clean up whatever messes needed cleaning. After all, that's what maintenance was really about, keeping things running smoothly so that everyone could do their best work. And helping children thrive was the most important work in the universe.